give an entire presentation about Gord. He was certainly influential in my life over a very short period of time. He's the one that recruited my wife and I back here to Victoria 5 years ago. It feels like yesterday. And so it is a true honor for me to be able to speak, not only as a keynote speaker, but in this situation for Gord, as I think the vast majority of the room will realize and know that here in Victoria, it would be Gord up here speaking today. So I will do my best. So let's start with a few aims over the next 50 or 55 minutes. I really want to showcase some of the science, past and present, that Gord brought to his work and leveraged through the Canadian Sport Institutes. The Canadian Sport Institutes are a network of 5 Olympic training centers across Canada, of which we have one here in town. But I also want to take some time to inspire some of you to think differently, perhaps, about some of your soft skills or emotional quotient, because that is so fundamentally important in sport, to be able to get integration of new ideas into the coach and athlete. And then finally, I thought I would try to dig out some old photos and some seminal studies and relive some great memories of Gord. So for those of you that go back through the years, you will see lots of great photos and some interesting haircuts. After Gord passed, we also uncovered an absolute gold mine in his office, which was his 2004 Athens Olympic diary, some 22 or 23 pages long. And is written in true Gord style, very flowing, very open, very honest. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to try and weave in some of these incredible insights that he had in 2004, and just really show that he was a thinker ahead of his time. So let's start with some important definitions. One, what is Gordology? The title of this talk. It's a noun, and I've titled it as Performance Optimization through Effective Integration of Applied Sports Science and Medicine, with the key word being integration. You can have the best idea in the world, but if you cannot implement that through great belief effect with the athletes and coaches you're working with, it will go nowhere. Secondly, let's establish what a Gordism is. It's another noun. It's the wisdom and advice featuring both IQ and EQ that Gord brought into complex and challenging sport situations. It's also pretty funny stuff Gord said. Before I jump in, I want to really take the time to highlight the incredible amount of academic mentors and collaborators and students that I've had the pleasure to work with over my academic career. It really does take a village or a city, and I really thank every single one of the students and mentors that I have. There are a few in particular that have absolutely been fundamental to me as a person, both in the way that I think about sports science and research, but also we've had a heck of a lot of fun together over the years, and I really hope it continues. And then finally, I absolutely need to highlight the incredible staff of the Canadian Sport Institute, some 65 strong. There isn't a week, let alone day, that goes by that I'm not inspired and floored by the amount of expertise and knowledge this group has. I think we had 20 or 12 abstracts here and 4 seminars, lecture seminars. I know Gord would be pretty proud of the bunch. So let's jump in. This is a Gordism. Sometimes we just have to jump off the cliff first, then build our wings on the way down. That was a classic Gord approach to most problems and situations. And yes, that is Gord and Wayne Gretzky with mullets. My talk today, I'll have kind of 3 sections. I don't think I'm presenting a single one of my studies because I thought I'd just talk about Gord's work and the legacy of his work that we're continuing on at the Canadian Sport Institute. I'll talk a little about recovery. I'll talk about handling heat. And then the last section, I'm going to try and bring it together and talk about the soft skills required to integrate this stuff in elite sport. So let's start with recovery, or Goldilocks effect. Too much or too little, or too hot or too cold. I'm the most recovered man on the planet. This is a quote Gord used to introduce a lecture that I spoke with him 5 years ago on the concept of recovery. He probably made a comment in that he hadn't been running as much as he should have, or that he loved the social context of social recovery. But he also had incredible insights into the concept of over-recovery or under-recovery. How do we manage this? Our elite athletes train when you add it all up, about 5% of the total waking hours. That leaves 95% of the time to make decisions that are either going to augment, neutralize, or negate training. Gord would always press upon us that we not only need to think about training stimuli and be experts in training adaptation and training periodization, we need to become experts in recovery periodization as well. I've blatantly stole some of Gord's old slides, Canadian Sports Centre. Someone in our communications department is upset with me right now, but that's okay. So here's one of our slides from Gord. In order for a system to show positive training adaptation, it must be overloaded. Fatigue in an endurance sport, excessive fatigue is required as long as it's planned and appropriate. Conversely, though, the other balance to this is to optimize training adaptation, work sessions must be interspersed with rest. And I think we need to think about rest on a micro level. How many minutes do you put between sets in the weight room? A meso level, do you do 10 workouts in the first 5 days of the week? What's the density of training? And a macro level, how often are you going to periodize in a recovery week or a recovery phase? Or what does recovery look like in year 1 of a quadrennial versus year 4 of a quadrennial? Quadrennial being the 4 years between the Olympics. Here's an insight from his 2004 diary on cold tub that I've snipped straight out. At the pool, I noticed the Aussies had an inflatable tub set up, presumably for use by athletes as a cold tub for recovery. I have not noted any swimmers using this tub for anything else but rinsing their swimsuits out. And if any of you worked in sport, and I'm looking down at the Aussies right now, you know how bloody often you need to fix these iCool, which are these portable cooling units. They're always breaking down. And Gord would say, well, you know, does a cold tub make sense in a swimmer who's already in the water 30 hours a week? Well, the context might be a lot different in a rugby player with high eccentric loads and muscle damage from the actual contact hits. And he really impressed upon me and said a lot to questions I had to him, it depends. Because he understood that every context was different in sport. Very few things in life are black and white, low carb, high carb. It's always context specific. So one of the first papers to suggest hydrotherapy might impair adaptation to training was this paper that came out of Japan in 2006 titled Post-Exercise Leg and Forearm Muscle Cooling in Humans Attenuates Adaptation to Training. However, if you really dig into this first paper, first of all, I'm not going to go through it because to my eye, all of these lines look pretty bloody similar. There's maybe some little non-statistical significance there. This paper had an N=6 of untrained subjects. The water protocol was 2 by 20 minutes at 5 Celsius. No one goes that cold in the real world. The test for performance was hand grip strength. Last I checked, that's not in the Olympics. And the groups were not well matched. But this paper did cause a buzz through the sports world. Are we overdoing our recommendations on recovery? I would suggest every article in Runner's World does, because most of the people that read Runner's World are suffering from undertraining. Sorry. I'm undertrained now too, so I'm calling myself out. So British sport at some point, at least what I heard through the ethos, halted, black and white, halted cold tub use leading into the Olympics. Here's a paper report in 2012, elite athletes wasting their time plunging into icy water after intense exercise. Clickbait, obviously, this is over the top, putting their health at risk. But it did cause a pause. Are we doing a disservice? Is that inflammatory response in exercise appropriate? I thought I'd highlight what I think is probably the best chronic study ever completed on cold tub, done at the Australian Institute of Sport, led by Shauna Halson. They took 33 very highly trained competitive cyclists, put them through 6 weeks of a very hard training camp, followed by the Tour of Canberra. They had 2 groups. They had their cold water immersion group, which was 15 Celsius, not 5, 15 Celsius for 15 minutes. They did this, 4 times per week. And then they had a control group. This is really important. And for those of you doing recovery research, I would encourage you to do this. They match groups both on a physical attribute maximal aerobic power, MAP, but they also matched groups on incoming belief in recovery. It is very hard to blind recovery studies other than some nutritional interventions, whether it's compression garments or cold tubs. The intervention is not blinded. And we need to do a better job engaging mental performance and sports psychology research to look at belief effect or placebo effect and measure that in our designs. And they did a good job on that here. I'll cut right to the performance tests. They did a whole series of them every week throughout the 6 weeks so they could track performance in the different groups. The blue dots are the cold tub or ice group, and the white dots are the non-cold tub group. And in general, across the board, you can see that the power outputs in the MAP test, the 1 second max power or a 10-minute time trial, generally are higher. And some might argue after about 3 weeks of pretty hard training, the separation becomes even more when fatigue is really starting to set in. I want to highlight performance testing is incredibly messy. These standard deviations are large, but the needle doesn't seem to suggest that there's any inhibition of training adaptation here. And indeed, Shauna Holson, the senior author, said, while some effects of cold water immersion on performance were unclear, data from this study do not support recent speculation that it's detrimental to performance or adaptation. The major mechanism in and around using cold tubs of why it might prevent adaptation is thought to be around inflammation. And this is a slide I threw in yesterday as this paper came out this week. Out of Australia in the J Physiol, they took 9 active men. They did a crossover design, pretty intense exercise where they had a cold water immersion, 10 Celsius for 10 minutes, or on the other day, 10 minutes of exercise. They did muscle biopsies and blood draws before, 2 hours, 24, and 48 hours after exercise. Long story short, this study showed no difference in anything. Here's just some of the inflammatory cytokines, IL-6 or TNF-alpha, and their conclusion was, and I could have shown creatine kinase, was at least in their hands, changes in inflammatory cells, cytokines, neutrophils, heat shock proteins did not differ between the groups. So this is a brand new paper to suggest perhaps cold water immersion is no more effective for reducing inflammation than a 10-minute bout of easy exercise. So there's a lot more information that we need to get a handle on what is exactly happening here. I won't go into nutritional recovery, although this is my field. I would encourage all of you to come to a great seminar later where we talk about when less is more and more is better. We've some outstanding international level speakers to talk about nutritional recovery later this morning. So to go back to one of Gord's old slides to bring this all together, stress and training and excessive overload is absolutely required in elite athletes. You want periods of inadequate overall systemic recovery. This line he put into this slide is hopefully a line that a good physiologist and coach can identify so that you don't end up in a beatdown phase, but that during a recovery block or a taper, you're going to accrue benefits and rebound to a higher level. Conversely, in this recovery presentation Gord had 5 years ago, he also identified the idea of over-recovery. This is unfortunately my current situation of life is if I get 3 runs in a week, I'm happy and just keep things status quo. But for the person trying to make an Olympic team, that doesn't quite work. So again, let's think about a context. Let's think about shades of gray. How do we plan recovery? And what are some things to consider if you're working in the real world with athletes? On the left, I've highlighted increased recovery emphasis. So that may be late in the quadrennial. During the specific preparation or competition phase, you want to increase recovery. If there's a quality emphasis in your training on that day. In sports that feature more eccentric or weight bearing and increased muscle soreness, you need increased recovery in those sports. Swimmers are out here. Brittle athletes, ones that get sick or injured often, and then I'd say young and veteran athletes probably need an increased recovery profile. that is the best recommendation I can give, and I know there's no if-thens, and because it's context-specific and it depends with all these variables that you're dealing with on recovery. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about probably Gord's most influential and seminal area, which is handling heat. We'll talk a little bit about pre-cooling. We'll talk a little bit about heat acclimation and handling heat throughout. So here's his Athens 2004 diary. This is before the cycling time trial. There were no fans available for cooling, and they did not use any pre-cooling strategies. This was Cycling Canada at the time. One of their physiologists is at the back, and I can tell everyone things have changed. They're much more progressive now. Their time trial is a perfect event for cooling because of its duration, high intensity, 40 to 60 minutes. On this particular day, the races were held in the heat of the day. A variety of pre-cooling strategies were being used by the Germans, Swiss, Dutch, Brits, Kiwis, Americans, and Australians. The funny thing is I think only the Dutch and the Aussies were doing a good job of it. This is 2004. So let's look at one of Gord's papers from 1999 in pre-cooling. And this is, at this time, there were probably 5 or 6 papers published using pre-cooling to augment performance in the heat. But the performance factors in those studies were prolonged endurance performance. And so this is the first study to look at pre-cooling in a 70-second performance bout. So it was a crossover design. They had very elite cyclists, 66 mLs. They did a 30 minutes of pre-cooling with water immersion at 12 to 14 Celsius, but legs were out of the water. You want warm muscles, cold core. And in the other situation, there was no pre-cooling. So let's just look quickly. First of all, pre-cooling certainly dropped rectal core temperature. This is the 10-minute warm-up, the 3-minute break, and then pre and post 70 seconds. What is interesting here is that even in the warm condition or no pre-cooling condition, these temperatures are still very low and much lower than what anyone would consider close to hypothermia or anywhere close to any ceiling effect. Yet, there was a 3.3% significant improvement on performance. This really changed the thinking of a lot of people at the time. How does a cold water immersion on a 70-second exercise test improve performance? Because obviously it has nothing to really do with hypothermia. And certainly at that time, with a lot of work with Stephen Chung, Gord's thinking about all the psychosomatic and skin temperature and what was going on in the brain was coming to the forefront in realizing there's a lot more at play than just core temperature here. Another area of seminal work was in and around Microtechnology, or the telemetry swallowable core temperature pills. This is a seminal paper in 2007. Prior to this, there were 3 or 4 papers out validating the pills in a laboratory setting. This is the first paper that was ever published looking at the pills out in the field in Kona. And just some data from that paper. This is Simon Whitfield. He'll be speaking to us later tonight. You can see how valuable it is to get perhaps core temperatures in swimming, 6,000 meters. 6 of these elite triathletes had no problem with maintaining core body temperature. This athlete, again, individual responses, actually was having issues maintaining core body temperature at 23 Celsius. I guarantee is probably also the leanest athlete and perhaps the most fatigued athlete coming into that session. But again, seminal work to push the laboratory into the field, which was a big part of Gord's mantra. What about lightweight cooling vests that are now everywhere? Again, there was a lot of research done at this point using cold tubs. Gord's was the very first paper to use an ice cooling vest and performance. This is from this paper in 2005 from Ergonomics. Literature on strategies and products for cooling the human body during sport application is relatively sparse, although not so for use of cooling devices in extreme work environments like firefighting. Interestingly enough, Gord spent some of his time in his youth as a firefighter, forest firefighter here on the island. So he had some insights already on what they did with pre-cooling in those environments. And this paper went on to show it extended the positive results from pre-cooling using either air or water to support the use of cooling vests before and after endurance exercise. And here's a picture of one of our original cooling vests. I'll say these are still some of the best cooling vests. I took 10 of them to Rio. We still use them. And a picture of Brent McMahon many, many, many years ago, which now, interestingly enough, he's the second fastest Ironman triathlete in the history of the event, sub 7 hours and 45 minutes last year. And I think Gord's legacy is probably still coming through with him and his coach in terms of some of their heat application, heat acclimation, pre-cooling strategies that they use. And now these are pictures I've taken at various world championships or the Olympics of commercial items of ice vests, or even this head cooling device that Nike made for Ashton Eaton, the world record holder in the decathlon. He is actually part superhero. So let's switch gears and talk about heat acclimation. Again, 2001, Gord was at the forefront. This is a really simple, elegant study. What happens when we heat acclimate people and put them in at 30 minutes of exercise at 70% VO2 peak in about 40 Celsius? What happens if we do that every day versus every other day? And we'll just look at the core temp and heart rate responses. And long story short, if you heat acclimate people every single day, you get a nice drop in core temperature and a nice drop in submaximal heart rate within about 10 days of acclimation. If you heat acclimate them and only put them into the heat chamber every other day, not much is happening. So again, from a practical use with athletes, this is pretty important information to know how to design a heat acclimation protocol effectively. Let's fast forward 15 years, and there's now a well-done meta-analysis that came out of Stephen Chung's lab earlier this year. There's 96 different heat acclimation papers now. The most common duration was 7 to 14 days. This is the major Hedges force plot for all the variables that they looked at. I'll just highlight things here. There was a stark and significant increase in performance and capacity with heat acclimation protocols. There's a decrease in resting and exercise core temperature, decreased skin temperatures, increased sweat rates, decreased resting and exercise heart rates, robust increases in plasma volume from heat acclimation, and then finally, at a given relative exercise, you can expect decreases in lactate, RPE, and exercise thermal sensations. I would say that these are pretty much consensus, and most people would agree that if you do a 10 to 14 day heat acclimation, these are the outcomes you can expect with your subjects. It's basically what I'm highlighting here, and that most of them probably do take 14 days. What's come out more recently in several papers now are heat acclimation for cool conditions. This is from 2010, where they took 12 cyclists. They did a host of physiological and performance measures before and after, so aerobic power, time trial, lactate threshold. And before heat acclimation, they did all these things in both a cold environment, 13 Celsius or cool, as well as a hot environment. They then did 10 days of 90-minute heat acclimation. And then they repeated those exercise tests again, both in a cold environment or cool and in the hot environment. They had a control group, which is really rare. I'm going to highlight this later. I won't show any of the control group outcomes because nothing happened really. Here's the pre-acclimation to post-acclimation performance plot. This is the line of neutrality, so everything on this side shows a significant improvement in performance from the heat acclimation. And there was significant performance improvements in the time trial, 6% increase in cool conditions and 8% in hot conditions. Again, the control group really showed nothing. Here, these are the post-test, pre to post percent increases. There's in both hot and cold, so stark increases in VO2 max, lactate threshold, cardiac output, plasma volume, and time trial. So it does fit up pretty nicely in terms of increasing plasma volume to potentially increasing cardiac output, to increasing VO2 max if the time trial's at very intense exercise in both warm and cool conditions. And so they really highlighted here that this data does provide increasing scientific basis for employing heat acclimation to not only improve performance in the heat, but to perhaps augment physical training programs. And indeed, there's an entire new review last year titled Adaptations to Heat and Exercise Under Cooler Conditions, a New Hot Topic. I do want to highlight that there is only a small number of studies yet, and that more work needs to be done to confirm the cool weather conditions. Julian's here in the crowd, and he presented this image the other day, but it's too good for me not to represent. This is out of a review that he led in 2015 that just shows the various physiological adaptations and their timelines. Things happen at different rates, and I would suggest we've gone to, in the field with elite athletes, heat acclimation protocols more around 5 to 7 days. Is this the minimal effective dose versus prolonged adaptations? Certainly you can get some robust changes already in 5 to 7 days. Certainly sweat rate takes a little bit longer, and to maximize exercise performance does take a little bit longer. I would encourage all of you that want to get into elite sport to think about the concept of minimal effective dose. These athletes are already training 20 to 30 hours a week. If you're going to put something new in, they won't like it. You usually have to pull something out. And so we need to do a lot more thinking and research in and around, I think, minimal effective dose. Why is it relevant? Elite athletes are already nearly maximizing training stress. Heat acclimation in all intervention protocols will decrease overall recovery profile. And then other things to consider that we need with our athletes is, do elite athletes already have nearly maximal plasma volumes? They're already training at a high level, and some of our measurements suggest perhaps yes. How cool or hot is the projected competition conditions? The World Cycling Championships are in Doha right now. If we had athletes going into that, we'd probably do the full 14-day protocol, given the heat conditions there. What are the specifics around travel and taper and jet lag? These are all things that in the elite world and in the applied world we need to consider. Another Gordism. One of Gord's visions was our mobile environmental trailer, which still sits in front of Pisces and Canadian Sport Institute. We realized very quickly that mobile was a tad bit ambitious. Once it got parked, Gord decided to use his truck to reposition it. It took over an hour. He moved it an inch and needed a new transmission. So it's kind of an ugly looking kind of, redneck trailer that sits in front, but inside it's a world-class heat chamber. We can dial in everything that we need to do, and it's a real legacy of Gord. So I thought I'd finish off this section with just highlighting a couple of recent studies that we've done that are in preparation for publication. They were presented as posters here, but some of the work that we continue to do at Canadian Sport Institute in the area of heat. So one of the things that we've done quite effectively is look at short-term heat acclimation approaches in some of our team sports, which is kind of novel, and in females. So we've done 2 different studies in our women's national Olympic soccer team. So yes, Christine Sinclair was sweating to the oldies in our groups. And we started this already way back in 2014. We've done ambient heat conditions. They used Cancun prior to the World Cup. In Canada, they used heat again prior to Rio. But we've systematically went through and looked at individual responses to heat. So in this study design, In this study design, we had a 5-day isothermically clamped. So we wanted people to get to 38.5 Celsius. So they used swallowable temperature pills every single day. We looked at heart rate, core temp, sweat rate, psychothermal stress. We also used carbon monoxide rebreathe for hemoglobin mass, plasma, and blood volume measurements before and after the 5 days of heat stress. And the women's soccer team uses a highly validated it's called the 30-15 intermittent fitness test. You can look it up, it's well published. And they've done this for many years. This is their typical test that they use for performance. So what did we find? In terms of core temperature, we hit the 38.5 exactly as we wanted over the 5 days. This is the time spent at 38.5, so about 35 to 50 minutes every bout. The average heart rate to elicit 38.5 in these athletes was about 80 to 85% of heart rate max. This was an intervention study. It is very hard to run control groups with elite athletes. So it is an intervention pre-post. It's not the best design. We also need to realize that training itself can increase plasma volume. So we went back, and Cesar, the lead physiologist, does an incredible job at looking at training loads for these athletes. This is the heat acclimation, This is the heat acclimation week of training. And this is the preceding normal peak training weeks. And this is what a taper and game week look like. So I think we're pretty confident that the stress that we induced with the heat acclimation protocol was typical of the stress that they get in a normal training week. The difference being here, the TRIMP score was mainly heat induced. So what did we find? We found a nice 9% increase in plasma volume. This study was run in February in similar weather that we had here. Plasma volume is highly sensitive to change, but also highly variable. But we also found a 1.6% increase in their 30-15 intermittent fitness test. I will highlight that the speed that they reached here, just over 20.3 kilometers an hour, to this day is still the best speed they have ever reached in that as a group on that test. So we were pretty confident that we're onto something here, and we did as much work as we could to measure this in some of our most elite athletes in Canada, and we've used this information. We got another master's student involved that did it in ambient conditions down in Cancun with core temperature pills, and they utilized a lot of this coming into Rio, and they tend to run a game that is very highly dependent on fitness, the Diamond protocol, and so they need a lot of fitness, and we look at this this way. They're ahead of the curve for Tokyo 2020 because it is going to be smoking hot and humid there. So the second study I thought I'd highlight is one we've just finished. We're still digging out of the data on this one. This was a direct legacy of Gord, as it was his idea that we implemented and worked on. So there's some thought that hydration status or dehydration may further augment the plasma volume responses that you get in a heat acclimation protocol. Dehydration is a stressor, like altitude, and perhaps that stimulates the adaptation further. So we did a 5-day isothermic protocol, 36 Celsius. Yes, you read that right, 33 freaking subjects. This will be by far the biggest heat acclimation study ever done. They were decently fit, 55 to 60 mLs per kg, but not super elite. And they were matched for fitness and randomized to one of 3 groups. These 2 groups, 1 and 2, were in the heat chamber, so they trained for the 5 days. The first group, 14 people, dehydrated throughout to negative 2% body weight, and then we limited their hydration for 2 hours after training to really provide a good dehydration stimulus. The second group was euhydrated all the way throughout, so we just tried to match fluid intake to body weight losses. And then we went on, and it was a pain in the butt, but we did this control group where they trained under the same cardiac stress, but in conditions of 22 Celsius, not 38. Again, there's very few heat acclimation studies that do the exercise control group. I can only think about 2 or 3 total. We used, and this is important, so just listen up, we used core temperature in the heat chamber. So we wanted them, dehydration and euhydration, at 38.5 Celsius, which elicited about 75% of heart rate max. The control group, we clamped to 75% heart rate max. So all 3 groups got the same cardiac stress. Plasma volume and performance were measured pre-post, again using carbon monoxide rebreathe. Here's the 3 groups. So we have dehydration, euhydration. Those are the 2 heat groups, and then the control group. Indeed, we did a great job, but no statistical difference on percent of heart rate max. But to elicit heart rate max and control, it requires higher wattages. To elicit 75% heart rate max in euhydration, it requires higher wattages. And the RPE scores were exactly like these wattages. The control group actually had higher RPE scores than the dehydrated heat group. The heat area under the curve, so this is the area under the curve for all the trials, obviously was higher in the heat chamber than control. But we found absolutely no differences in the groups for either plasma volume changes or the improvement in time trial. All three groups improved time trial by about 2% and equal. Again, this is one of the very few studies that have used an exercise control group. So our conclusion right now is the lack of difference between the groups for plasma volume expansion and time trial suggests that relative cardiac stress plays a greater role in short-term training adaptations than either heat or hydration in sub-elite. These are 55 to 60 ml type subjects. These are not the 75 to 80 ml subjects. And so I think just bringing relatively moderately trained subjects in and just pushing them hard on some intervals for 5 days is going to do as much for your plasma volume as sticking them into the heat chamber. So interesting results, and we're going to dig in, do some linear mix modeling, because we have 33 subjects here and various responses to try and move this field forward. All right, my last section is titled Gordology. And that's Gord in the middle, doing an anthro on Wayne Gretzky. That's Gord, who was influential with Ryan Cochrane, one of the best swimmers in Canadian history, and then Gord again here with Simon Whitfield. Key word here is integration. Working in sport is tough, but great applied sports science should be done at a level and quality control that if we wanted to publish it, we probably could. Make your work research grade. This is something Gord said to me about 5 years ago. Fair enough, it's not going to be a double-blind, placebo-controlled intervention trial. But are we pushing and monitoring and collecting the metrics we need with our athletes to write up a really good case study? I hope so, and that's what we aspire to do at our institute. Gord always would preach about prioritizing interventions. Obviously, at the base of any intervention you're going to do with an athlete is the basics: lifestyle habits, sleep, blood work, a good training plan. As we move up, we think about plug-and-play interventions. These are some of the great research that many of you do that we would integrate with an athlete or coach for the first time. So it's new to them. And then very rare at the top, you might have a top secret strategic advantage, but they're actually more rare than most people realize. As we move up the pyramid, the cost and ease of implementation tends to go from low to high. And hopefully the athletes that you're dealing with in terms of long-term athlete development go from lower level to higher level. Although unfortunately, I do know many Olympians who still need a lot of work on the basics. A lot of work. But the key question that we need to ask is, what is the impact factor for a given intervention? And where is the athlete or team's gap to the demands of the sport? We aren't going to address all weaknesses. Our marathoners' basic sprint speed is horrible. That's fine, it's a weakness. We'll let that one go because it's not going to matter in relation to the marathon. So it takes a lot of testing of the individual athlete, but then an appreciation of the demands of the event or sport and looking at those gaps individually. As an example, if I take the classic paper from Joyner and Coyle, I add a brain up there. They did a nice job on the endurance realm looking at the major impactors, not all of them, of performance, velocity, or power across aerobic, anaerobic, and economy. Very quickly, and I'm sure I've missed some, in the 18 sports we work with at CSI Pacific in the last 4 years, these are just the examples of some of the interventions we've done with our sports. All sorts of stuff. I'm not going to read through all that, other than to highlight it's probably about 30 different strong to semi-evidence-based interventions in just endurance sport. We are certainly not shoving 30 interventions down every athlete's throat. It's planned, it's thought out. Where are they at in their curve? How do we want to periodize it across the quad? It's also important that elite athletes have smaller effect sizes. Here's a meta-analysis on sodium bicarbonate performance. The trained athlete effect size is 0.2 or small, while the untrained effect size is 0.6 or moderate. Athletes are probably on a sigmoidal curve of adaptation throughout their career. Me and my colleagues work out here. Your male subjects without a menstrual cycle who want to make $500 with a VO2 of 50 are somewhere in here. So if the study is not controlled well, it is easy to show that lactate threshold training works. It's easy to show short interval training works. It's easy to show long interval training works because there's just so much headroom to move into. And so it's hard for us in the elite field sometimes to take that data and apply it, because we'll have our rowers at a 300-kilometer week with 14 training sessions. What's the protein recovery window on that one? I have no idea. The other thing and challenge in sport is the science is low ranking source of knowledge amongst coaches. This is a paper in 2015. 28% of coaches got information from another coach, 2% from a sports scientist, 1% from academic journals, and only 2% would self-reflect. This is the reality of working in elite sport, and if you want to get into elite sport, you have to appreciate and understand that dynamic. Therefore, as a sports scientist who has not yet fully developed trust, it is pretty difficult to convince a coach to try new ideas or interventions. I want to highlight something Dave Clark brought to our institute in a talk about a year ago, and I really like this model, and I've used it with a few coaches that I have got good trust with. And that's the idea of moving applied sports science decisions from arbitrary or intuition or out here towards higher level of evidence or practice-based outcomes. I like the fact that he has said your own individualized, developed data is a higher level of knowledge for coaching decisions than published science. And if any of you have read Claude Bouchard's heritage study, that should make sense to you. You give someone an average training program, expect average outcomes. So basically, you write down all your decisions here, like, why did you give 6 hours rest and not 3 hours rest? Or why did you do 10 sets instead of 5 sets? And you try to document where the coach actually comes up with this stuff, or the practitioner. And the goal is over time, and obviously even in science there's various levels of evidence. Over time, you try to reduce the number of decisions supported by weak sources of knowledge. I think the number one focus of every applied sports scientist is to integrate validated and individualized monitoring and metrics to help drive informed decision making. That is what our job is, no matter what discipline area you're in. Allow the coach to make better decisions. And then what about trying to do research and interventions with elite athletes? This was tweeted out by Lee Hamilton. This is a great slide. Down here we have from bed rest studies to the highly elite. And up here in green, we have the number of people in a population that are available for a study. Across the bottom, obviously elite athletes have very high training loads. They have very limited scope to add stimulus. Their adaptive potential is tiny because they're already at the ceiling, and therefore the probability of finding no or meaningful change is quite high. So this is the you need a constitution of iron study zone if you're a grad student. This zone tends to be the easiest, sedentary to physically active, huge effect sizes, and lots of them. The last little section here is just about soft skills required. I used to think there was a breakdown in knowledge translation from theory to practice. More and more of what I'm observing is there seems to be an apathy of trying new things and perhaps some cynicism, both from coaches and athletes. We have a lot of work to do in breaking these barriers down and have to gain the trust of these people at the cold face of sport. I think he probably meant cold face, but that's he was a two-finger typer, so that's... So let's talk about the placebo effect. Chris Beatty has a great paper on caffeine. He brought in 6 well-trained cyclists. They did 2 baseline time trials, 10K on the bike, and then 3 intervention trials where they got either, and they were told what they got. They got 0, 4.5, or 9 milligrams per kg body weight caffeine. Here's the results and the power output during the 10K time trial. Here's your 0 caffeine, increased power on 4.5, and even increased power again on 9. Placebos were administered in all conditions here, folks. So not only are we having a placebo effect, we're having a dose-response placebo effect. And this is the quantitative data. There's a bunch of qualitative data in this paper where these people had more jitters and side effects. What about not even trying to trick people? For nutritionists in the field, 80 primary female IBS patients were randomized to either, and this was on their pill bottle. Placebo pills made of an inert substance like sugar pills that have been shown in clinical studies to produce significant improvement in IBS symptoms through mind-body self-healing process, or no treatment. Across the board, every single IBS outcome was improved with the pills with this on the label. You don't even need to trick the athlete or patient in this thing. Cook and Cruther do some really neat work. I encourage a lot of you to read some of their papers. They took 12 pro rugby players and they completed video sessions with accompanying coach feedback the day after a rugby union match. The intervention showed either, with appropriate coach feedback, video footage of player mistakes with the jerk coach, negative coach feedback, or player successes with positive coach feedback. And both of these were repeated twice. Positive coach feedback significantly elevated testosterone compared to the negative feedback. I can show you the cortisol, it's exact opposite. You give negative feedback, cortisol's through the roof. And it translated into significant positive performance outcomes. This is pretty powerful, not only for coaches, but for us as integrated support staff. How do you talk to your athlete? How do you talk to your coach? What words do you use to inspire your grad student? Are they leaving your office with higher testosterone or higher cortisol? So in general, and this is the world Gord skated so well. On one side, with our research activities, we want to minimize placebo effect via questionnaire-confirmed, placebo-controlled, double-blinded research designs. But when we're working in the field, I want to try to maximize belief effects through carefully worded and presented implementations of validated interventions. I'm not going to be a used car salesman, but I'm going to think a lot about how I approach a coach and athlete with the types of words that is going to resonate with them. So I'm all for belief effect, except for if it causes increased costs or dependence by the athlete, which is kind of how the medical community deals with placebo effect as well. So I'll stop there. I hope that gave you a bit of a journey of Gord and a little bit of insight into the elite of elite sport. I'd like to thank the conference. I'm truly humbled to speak here today, and my Canadian Sport Institute.